Hi, my name is Victor. I've embarked on this MA to try and answer some questions about my own photography practice. I've been questioning for some time why I'm picking up my camera. What am I trying to say? Do I have something to say? Do I have a style? Joel Meyerowitz said in an interview, "The moment when you see something or something happens and you gasp or you say, 'Oh wow, look at that,' those moments, those are the true you. If you recognize those moments, you begin to see your true identity. Then the way you make your photograph, your identity, your fingerprint, your framing, your sense of timing, your closeness, this becomes your style." But have I lost my style? Can I recognize my own style anymore? I've become so stuck, so boring. I need to break through that boredom. I remember something from the introduction to this course. Either Colin or Paul said, "Be willing to pick apart the ways you've grown accustomed to working and to think about how you can do things differently and in ways that are going to challenge you." That's why I'm here. I'll give you an overview of where I've been, followed by my current practice, and finally some ideas on where I'd like to go. This Brownie Starlet from the late 1950s was the first camera that I held. Probably around 1970, I would have been around 10. That's where it started. I went from there on to the Kodak Instamatic with the typical square format images, alternating between that and my father's Mamiya. I was in the school photography club. We used to print a lot of images, these from 1978 I believe. Ultimately went on to my first real camera, which I believe everyone should start on, the Pentax K1000. One might think that as a photographer in South Africa in the 1970s and 80s, we would be under the shadow of David Goldblatt. Goldblatt, however, preferred to document the commonplace, places where nothing really happened. These, of course, were not the pictures that the world wanted to see. These first few images from David Goldblatt's Some Afrikaners show the average life of the South African and the landscape, followed by Johan Koos with some disturbing images, and finally followed by some images by Ken Oosterbroek of the Bang Bang Club. The final frames from his camera before he was sadly killed next to James Nachtwey. Growing up in a white middle-class suburb, I was completely isolated from that part of the country. I saw the images in the news, but kept well away from the trouble spots. Looking back over my 45 years as a photographer, I find I can divide my progress into 3 distinct phases, aligning with time spent in 3 separate cities in 3 separate countries. I'm sure that this year, with all of its strangeness and opportunities, will be the start of a new chapter. My early years in Cape Town were spent learning the craft, developing printing, exposure, camera operation, initially with and ultimately running the school photography club, aided by art classes at high school. During these early years, I'd photograph everything from people to landscapes, documenting mainly the lives of my family and friends and my travels overseas. I left Cape Town in 1997 and moved to Dubai, where I enrolled in the New York Institute's professional photography course to fill in some gaps in my knowledge. Around this time, I acquired a newfound courage and started saying yes to some important and well-paying shoots, from British American Tobacco to an advertising shoot for a large Saudi-based cosmetics company. I've always had an engineer's brain, focusing more on the technical rather than the abstract, but towards the end of this period became interested in other aspects of the craft and became an avid reader of various histories and critical works. I came across a book by Jeff Dyer called The Ongoing Moment. This is Dyer's unique and idiosyncratic history of photography. Seeking to identify their signature styles, Dyer looks at the ways that figures such as Stieglitz, Strand, Evans, Kertész, Lang, Arbus and Eggleston have photographed the same scenes and objects. In doing so, Dyer constructs a narrative in which those photographers, many of whom have never met in their lives, constantly come into contact with each other. I began to see elements of my own work within its pages, my pictures of an accordion player bearing a marked similarity to those in the book. Another example is my image of the Melbourne Underground, which I thought to be entirely unique. Imagine my surprise 2 weeks ago when I discovered an uncannily similar image, albeit black and white, taken in 1864 by Felix Nadar in the Paris sewers. Do we all continue to photograph the same subjects over and over again? Moving on, whilst in the Middle East I attended a fashion workshop with Bruce Smith, a British fashion photographer, and found a new love to add to my portrait and landscape interests, which I keep to this day. Regarding my influences, I'll have to say that my current work is informed by everything I have ever read, everything I've looked at and seen in my various lives, from Africa through the Middle East and down to Australia, and every conversation in every dingy bar. But on the fashion side, I enjoy the work of Helmut Newton, Guy Bourdin, Albert Watson, Herb Ritz, Merton Marcus and others. On the landscape side, while I own every Goldblatt book, I'll have to say that discovering this man, Ubi Oberholzer, changed the way I look at pictures. This man taught me how to photograph South Africa. I love his use of colour, and this is where I get my love of a more saturated image. Goldblatt's images, once he moved to colour, are more restrained. This last image, as it transitions to colour, and the few that follow, show the current state of my landscape and portrait photography. These are from a recent trip to South Africa, where I drove 4,000 k's north to south, across east and back up north again, over the space of about 2 weeks. Leaving the Middle East, I made a move down to Melbourne, Australia, where I opened a studio above a coffee shop just north of the city, shooting mainly family and portraits, while sticking to my first love of fashion, with images such as these: studio shots, fashion indoor and outdoor, some studio nudes, a bit of experimental studio, and some thermal images. Around this time I had my first 3 joint exhibitions in Melbourne, and began to question my photography yet again, this time wondering what makes a photograph art. Why do some images end up on the gallery wall and others don't? Sontag mentions, "To us, the difference between the photographer as an individual eye and the photographer as an objective recorder seems fundamental. The difference often regarded mistakenly as separating photography as art from photography as a document." In his book Photography Changes Everything, Marvin Heiferman says, "To date, most connoisseurs of photography approach the medium of photography as if it were a picture-making form like any other, like painting or like drawing. In fact, most of the billions of pictures that are taken every year are made for purposes that have nothing at all to do with art." So that brings me back to my original question. What makes a photo art? Is a photograph of an event, a record photograph, like war reporting, is it art? Does it belong in a museum or a gallery? Does the act of hanging a photo in a gallery make it art? Is this act purely decided by the curator, or the public, or the buyer? Does the photographer have no say over what makes his work art? I aim to use the next 2 years to more fully explore and try and answer that question, using Australia and my experiences here as a jumping off point. I found for a country that's so new, very few people seem to actually be from Australia. Many that I've spoken to regard themselves as either Italians or Greeks, Vietnamese, Chinese, and when asked, "How long have you been here?" they'll say, "Oh no, I was born here." So what then makes an Australian? What is an Australian? I find local photographers and international photographers see the country rather differently. At 2 recent exhibitions at the Leica Gallery in the city, one by local Nick Rains, the other by New York photographer Bruce Gilden, Nick Rains saw the country as a typical Australian picture of the outback with horses, while Bruce Gilden tended to concentrate more on the Melbourne underground with the Italian gangsters. I think Bruce Gilden got it right. Another local photographer, Kate Gollings, recently published a book simply called Australians, where she photographed 100 prominent Australians and wrote a small story about each one of them. I intend to photograph a random group of Australians and ask them a set of questions. What makes you Australian? I'll publish both the photograph and the answers side by side and see if that comes any closer to answering my question, what exactly is an Australian?